think today what I want to do is talk to you about the research that we did looking at not only the science of chronic wasting disease, but I'm going to be interjecting a lot of stories and comments about what it was like to live through a period of time when a major disease hit the most popular game species, or second most popular, depending on how you see it, in North America. And this was nothing short of a real watershed moment, a transformative moment, where we've never dealt with a major disease outbreak quite like this. And in a place like Wisconsin, not unlike the Northeast, where deer are the sacred cow, this is really a point that is culturally heartfelt by many people, to have a disease come in and impact a species that you're so connected to culturally. And this is what life is like in Wisconsin. So what I want to do is, and thanks to Deidre for helping me coin the term, deer wars was easily something I thought of, but behind the front lines was not, and but it actually is a really good way to capture what I want to focus on. 2002 was when chronic wasting disease was first discovered in central New York, and it was earlier identified back in Colorado in about 1963, an unnamed prion disease. They didn't even know it was prions, and I'll tell you what those are in a minute. But it was something that was 100% fatal, and there is no cure. There was no cure then. There is no cure now. It is a devastating disease that can creep through a population of white-tailed deer. And when it hit, I'll never forget the moment. I was all excited. I was presenting a paper at the Wisconsin chapter of the Wildlife Society meeting, and it was on deer sterilization, another kind of hot button topic. And we're excited to present the results of this work in Highland Park around Chicago, and all of a sudden people started trickling out of the room. And there was a big hubbub, and we got done with the paper, went out, and turned out that across from us in another conference room, there was a big press release going on, or a press announcement. And it was basically that they had discovered chronic wasting disease in south central Wisconsin. So it was packed, and reporters were there, and all this focus on this devastating disease, and really then launched in a world and a life of its own. The very first thing that happened after it was announced was a team of modelers got together at UW-Madison to work with the biologists at the DNR. And they wanted to first model what would happen if you make some assumptions about the disease, and what will happen to the deer population. So in the first 2 years, before we even really got going with field work, they came up with a scenario of what happens to southern Wisconsin's deer population when you introduce 100% fatal disease in deer densities that possibly get up to 120 per square mile. And around here, I'm presuming we're probably around 30, maybe. I don't know the deer densities, but much, much lower in this climate. But if you start with a seed of chronic wasting disease, we knew about the prion disease back then and modeled it, you could see that it would rapidly spread, if you want to call it 10 years rapid, and then start to die out and create a donut effect where the deer will die from the epicenter of the disease outbreak. And when this model hit the press, the public and the DNR were just totally alarmed. And part of the problem is they didn't know how we were going to slow it, and they didn't know whether chronic wasting disease was going to cross the barrier and impact humans. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But this was the very first starting point that got the public alarmed, the DNR alarmed. And following this model that was published in the popular press, there were a lot of money came in from the government, a lot of money from the state, and the impact was that it launched a 10-year, what do I want to say, incredible focus on deer management in central Wisconsin. And so this was the starting point that was important, that it was a model that was done by John Carey in the Wildlife Department at UW-Madison that really made it clear that this could have very drastic impacts and dire impacts on deer hunting and the deer culture in south central New York. I'm sorry, Wisconsin. Okay, so these aren't great photos, sorry, but this does give you the sense that what happened after that model came out was a lot of conversation, and the DNR tried to be inclusive and engaging. They had public forums to look at and listen to what is the most concern to the public, and they wanted to be inclusive, but what they ultimately adopted after many, many hearings, and I'll never forget being at one at a gymnasium south of Madison, where people were shouting at the DNR, and faculty members, our extension faculty members were doing their best to contain the crowd, and it was an uproar because the hunters didn't want to change their culture of hunting. They didn't want to change what they valued about it, but they knew this was going to have huge impacts on every aspect of the fall moving forward. So this is the scene. It was pretty much chaos, and what the DNR ultimately did then to try to rein in a more organized approach to study it, understand it, and then move towards management was they did a command and control, and it was a military approach. So it was a very hierarchical approach, and they had command center. It was run like an emergency operations center where they had police and game wardens going out to these hearings and trying to contain them, but also internally in the DNR set up a very hierarchical structure of how they're going to begin introducing concepts like sharpshooting and things that would totally outrage private landowners. And keep in mind that most of this was on private land. So this was going to be something that pulled in many, many landowners. Tom Heberlein, a well-known human dimensions researcher, after 2 years wrote a very interesting article called Fire in the Sistine Chapel. And I think this was a very apt description of what was happening. It was the sacred cow, it was the sacred community, the culture of deer hunting in southern Wisconsin. And he described in that article how immediately after chronic wasting disease broke out, that's kind of not a good way to describe it, once it was discovered, deer hunting licenses dropped, revenues dropped. I mean, it was just, again, a very quick economic impact that was felt throughout the DNR. Hunters were worried about how this was going to hit the resource, but they really then took a dive, and the hunting community declined drastically in those first several years after this was first discovered. So this is just an idea or a way to frame the setting for you so that you can get a sense of how concerned people were, not just about the deer population, but there are serious questions about whether it was going to be transmitted to humans and to cattle and other livestock species. And in central Wisconsin, big dairy state, huge concern. Let me just tell you a little bit about the disease. So chronic wasting disease is a disease of the central nervous system, and it is transmitted by something called a prion. A prion is a protein that we all have in its normal state. It's affiliated with disease or with neuron transmission, signal transmission, and once it is introduced into an organism, it basically is spread throughout the lymphatic system, and this particular prion affects all cervids, so white-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, and moose. And it was first discovered, as I said, in the late 60s in Colorado. But it is, we think, related to a disease called scrapie in sheep, and it's part of the family of the TSEs, or the transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. So it's slowly progressing. Once it does hit incubation times of, let's see if we can get it to come up, 2 to 4 years. It usually doesn't express in clinical symptoms until about 16 months, we think, after an animal's been infected.
Excuse me, how does it jump?
How does it jump?
Prion is a molecule.
Yeah,
It's not even an organism.
we'll talk about how it's introduced, but jumping is not really the right way to describe it. The jumping metaphor would be, how does it jump to a different organism altogether? And what we were worried about very early on, not knowing whether this is going to be similar to mad cow disease or scrapie, or worse yet, Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease in humans, which is also a prion-based disease. So these are clearly related diseases that are 100% fatal. Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease is long known to be affiliated with cannibalism, and this is one that is 100% fatal in humans. And so they're related, but the prions discovered in this case are slightly different from those that cause these other diseases. Okay, so I mentioned it is a standard protein that we all have, but the abnormally shaped one, which occurs once an abnormally shaped protein is introduced into the system, comes into contact and It basically transmutes or causes normal ones to deform. And once those deform and spread out through the system, they attack the central nervous system. And in the end, brain tissue begins to degrade and take on a holy appearance. It just starts to decompose or degrade. So it's definitely something that cannot be stopped once it has been introduced. So anyways, it's something that I think, as I tell you in just a minute, it's not going to go away, and it's very difficult to degrade these prions. When it hits a deer or an elk, it has an effect of just a slow decline in overall quality, emaciation and loss of bodily fluids. And so seeing a sick deer out there is not necessarily something that would be a sign that chronic wasting disease is in the population, because it mimics many other diseases. But in central Wisconsin, if anybody sees a sick deer, a big red flag goes up because we don't know what it is. So this was, again, something that the DNR was concerned with. The transmission routes. Prions can be transmitted among organisms or among deer horizontally through saliva, urine, feces, and quite possibly tissue. So they're very tiny, they're hard to detect, and the way that most of the detection occurs is by distilling something that's been spiked with prions and re-injecting it back into cervidized mice. So mice it's a very long process to detect the presence of prions. Secondary, and maybe this is now the primary way of it's being transmitted, is through contaminated environments, soils, direct contact with a contaminated soil, and I'll show you shortly, possibly in plants as well. So this is where we're starting, at least in 2006, what it looked like in North America. A hot spot in south central Wisconsin, northern Illinois, hot spots around the country, Saskatchewan, up in Canada, and certainly big hot spots out here in the Rocky Mountain area. You flip forward to this, and a little bit hard to see, but it's clearly spreading. There are new outbreaks and showing up in interesting places, and we're not exactly sure why it has this particular pattern. There's been a long concern about whether this is being spread through game farming, and whether this was introduced through a game farm setting.
Game farms?
Yes, the isolated ones are typically the game farms. Yeah, yep, captive facilities. So this is another part of the social piece of this, is that the captive breeders felt impugned early on and extremely upset that they were being pegged as the source and the way it was being spread. So a lot of controversy among the wildlife managers, the captive breeders, the public who didn't know what was going on, and then even the public being possibly responsible for the spread by taking deer carcasses. A lot of people hunting out west, maybe taking the carcass back home or parts of it, disposing of it in the wild, and possibly reintroducing. So we really don't know how it was being spread. It's very suspect to look at the game farms and see how this might be the case, but it's really not known at this point how it's been spread around. It is not, I can tell you this, not due to dispersal of deer. They're not dispersing that far, which actually is kind of a funny point to all of us, but the general public still, some to this day, think that these are deer who are moving around the country for various reasons. But anyways, so this is the current state of it, and not yet currently in the Vermont area, but in central New York, and I think it's probably a matter of time. There's a better depiction of just the general range of this. Okay. When it was first discovered, the testing was very intensive, and we had mandatory check stations in central Wisconsin, and it was a process where the hunters would bring their carcasses in, they would remove the retropharyngeal lymph nodes, and then it would take just about 3 months to get the results back. So the hunters had to hold on to their deer carcasses and not consume the meat. And the guidelines were when you handled a deer, you wore gloves, you didn't want to come into contact with blood or any other potential tissue that would transport the prions. And So it was a long waiting process before you actually got the results back. And I just added these bars to show you where we are now. So in a 1.5-year-old deer, there's a fairly low prevalence rate, so about 3% and maybe 2 and 3% for females and males back in 2002. This is where we are today. So these added bars show the increase in prevalence rate in about a 13-year period. So a slow, if you will, increase overall, but we're up to now 1 out of 4 males or bucks has chronic wasting disease in the endemic area in central Wisconsin. And that is only poised to grow. We see out in Colorado, it's getting up to about 40% in some areas, the Boulder area, so it's a pretty serious thing, and it's in mule deer. So 13 years, it's grown quite a bit, and there's no indication that's going to slow. So part of the research that I directed was a team of students to go out and look at deer behavior and ask more detailed questions about how is it being transmitted on the landscape. My personal focus for years has been on deer behavior and social behavior primarily. And we were asking questions about how is it transported across the landscape? Because we know that dispersal in deer can be described, and it is not, deer aren't leaving and aren't dispersing for very long distances, about 1.5 miles on average. So how are we seeing it pop up all around the state? We're trying to get that piece of what's realistic in terms of the rate of spread, and how are we going to work with containing a message to the public that this is not a rapidly growing fire, as I think most people felt it was when it was first discovered. We just didn't know how quickly it was going to spread across the landscape. So our group was really looking at deer behavior. The other thing that was very important to us was to understand that social behavior of deer impacts and determines the rate of spread. And we know for white-tailed deer, mule deer, most cervids, they exist in matrilineal groups. And this is true for most mammals, the exception being carnivores will not always follow this pattern, bears, primates, and these are groups that are formed by highly related individuals or highly related females, so mother and offspring stay in mostly the same place for life, very low dispersal rate for female deer, and bachelor groups will form 1.5-year-old bucks, and by the time they're about 2 years old, almost all bucks have dispersed from the area. So the structure where females stay in groups for life, and the bucks are primarily leaving. So that then indicated that when it is transmitted across the landscape, it's more than likely traveling with the bucks that are leaving. We were concerned about direct contamination, and if we found a social group that had one individual that was infected, it was likely in our thinking that maybe most of those females were going to be infected. And then how do we actually describe the clustering of deer across the landscape? And we had some ideas about management, that if we had an infected social group, could we go in and do a surgical strike and take out the social group of females to try to slow the spread of chronic wasting disease. So we were looking at the social facilitation model and how this actually functions on the landscape. Some of this model actually was based on my work a long time ago in the Adirondacks, and this is where we first described the Rosepetal hypothesis, which is kind of a well-known hypothesis or paradigm that describes deer behavior, where these are the social groups of female, and in a model of CWD, you could have a female in one social group infecting the rest of the deer in the social group, and eventually all females would be infected. You could see a buck that might start off as a juvenile that might be infected and disperses to another area, and then introducing it into another social group. But by and large, this is the model of deer populations across the landscape. They are very clearly in these matrilineal groups, a high level of philopatry, which means animals that stay in their home range for life, their natal area. Philopatry for females, but not for males, and the males then are leaving these social groups. There is a fair amount of information and documentation on pen deer, and early in, I want to say in the 1980s, they were infecting pen deer in Colorado and studying them. And when they removed them from the pen, they found that when they reintroduced uninfected deer into those pens up to 3 years later, 2 or 3 years later, those animals would come down with chronic wasting disease. So that was the first discovery that the prions were persisting in the environment for a fairly long period of time. And they didn't know whether it was on the pen material, in the soil, how they were getting reinfected. They just knew if they put clean deer back into these pens, they would be reinfected and then come down with chronic wasting disease.
What year was that?
I don't remember the exact year, but it was back in the 80s. Beth Williams' work back in Colorado was, with pen deer. So it's fairly, well before it was discovered in Wisconsin. They were looking at this in Colorado and Wyoming. So anyway, so that was the first indication that it was probably based in the environment and further compounded a landscape scale management effort trying to eradicate it. So as we approached this whole paradigm in southern Wisconsin, there was a clear focus on understanding deer behavior, and that was balanced by the need to go after large-scale eradication, which was the DNR's perspective, and not a lot of focus on using deer behavior as a mechanism to manage. So we began to reveal information that this was clustered on the landscape, and you could actually see that from harvested deer, that there were clusters of this, and it was probably in those matrilineal groups. The DNR, in most places that manage deer, are charged with taking as many deer off the landscape as they can in different deer management units. So it was not a strategy that was tailored towards what we understood with the behavior. So it's managing to take as many deer out of deer management units, but not necessarily directed at the actual hotspot of where the disease was. So this is an issue that is going to be now probably responsible for why we cannot eradicate it off the landscape. I would have loved to have shown you a map of, maybe someday I'll try to resurrect this. It's a land ownership map, and so you can see where the disease hotspots were and where it was first discovered versus public land and private land. And the private landowners did not want the DNR to come onto their property. They weren't convinced that chronic wasting disease was going to have the devastating impact that we predicted it would. And they particularly did not want to acknowledge that their hunting patterns were going to have to change, that they were going to have to take more deer off the landscape. And is anybody a hunter here? Good, I am too, so it's okay. Okay, so there is a real bias against taking does. And we all know from any basic population dynamics class that the only way to manage deer is to cull or reduce the females. So they're basically the key management tools. And when you take a male off the landscape, really has no impact on the population dynamics, because it takes one male to inseminate a number of females, and until you control the number of females, you really can't control the population. So, but that's a cultural thing. And the private landowners did not want to have anybody come onto their land to tell them to harvest does. So there was inherent conflict between what the DNR saw needed to be done in terms of really hammering the deer population, and the private landowners who said, over my dead body, you're not going to come in and do sharpshooting, you're not going to have us take does. And the DNR then implemented an earn a buck requirement. So in order to take a buck, you had to show evidence that you had taken a doe. A very unpopular strategy for central Wisconsin. And it was, again, one of those things that incited a we-they mentality, where these horrible fights began between the DNR scientists and the landowners, who said, we're not going to change our practices. It's this sacred week between the week before Thanksgiving and the Sunday after Thanksgiving, which is the gun deer season primarily, and a long-held tradition for people to be hunting that week. So our work was, again, revealing some things that we felt if the DNR had been able to adopt and say that we understand the transmission process to be limited to hotspots and dispersing males, it might have led to a different strategy of the DNR rather than wholesale reduce the population, earn a buck, And they knew their recommendations. They just were correct. They did need to reduce the deer population, but what they couldn't do because of landowner patterns was take a surgical strike. And I'm not completely sure the DNR really believed that the surgical strike based on behavioral information was the tool. Yeah, so this basically our focus was looking at dispersal and deer behavior patterns and clustering among the females. Just wanted to show you, this was my great team. Dozens of students from the Department of Wildlife Ecology were out trapping deer and running check stations. But it's very tough to get lymph node samples from a live deer. Dead deer, you just kind of turn them upside down and go in through the throat, but we had to take tonsil biopsies. Very interesting process, but we did this under veterinarian's guidance and in the dead of winter. So trapped using clover traps and rocket nets, pretty elaborate operation. And big box traps too. Has anybody here done radiotelemetry before on deer? Yeah, or on any animal, yeah. So you know how intensive it is. So we actually track these deer almost daily, post-capture and throughout the winter to document their ranges. Hundreds of thousands of relocations on these deer, a gigantic database that we distilled then to look at their patterns on the landscape and find out how they were clustering. Not so interesting, but a lot of deer. Captured over 170 some deer. I don't show you the size of the home ranges, but this was important because females have actually relatively small home ranges. They're only about a square mile or less. Adult bucks have larger home ranges, maybe up to about 3 square miles. And this paradigm that I mentioned, this Rosepetal theory, is a very well-documented theory where a matriarchal female might hold a central home range and her female offspring establish, so probably someone here, so her female offspring establish home ranges that are overlapping hers, and that's how we get that Rosepetal paradigm. But this is actual data from 2 of the social groups, and what's interesting to me, this is a road, they don't cross over. So this is what you see on the landscape. This is, to my knowledge, just about every deer population in North America looks like this with these groups.
How big is that road?
It's a county highway, so it's a 2-lane road.
So it's
Yeah.
big enough because I mean I've lived on a dirt road.
Yeah.
The deer don't mind crossing.
No,
that.
they don't. No, they don't. And in most of the cases, that's true. I think this is kind of unusual that we didn't see any crossover. But this is based on a lot of data to actually document those. And what we did is then we looked at those animals that were tested. We only had maybe 3 or 4 that came back positive, and we wanted to study those. And I questioned the decision. And ultimately, I don't think it was the wrong one, but we had wanted to leave the infected animals on the landscape so we could study the transmission. And of course, the DNR said absolutely not, and they came in as soon as the tonsil biopsies came back positive. They came out and shot the deer through sharpshooters. So we took out the positive deer in these social groups. And I would say that we were doing this research only about a 6-year period, and in the 6 years we did not see the disease clustering. It was not a long enough period to see it move through the social groups. So it was further indication that chronic wasting disease is a fairly slow moving disease within a population, and when we detected it in many other states and other counties in Wisconsin, it was really an indication that it's quite possible that it's been there for a long time, and it's a function of our intensity of sampling to discover it, rather than an indication of how rapidly it's moving. We looked at a number of different variables trying to relate it to landscape characteristics, edge, forest, agriculture, ratios, deer density, harvest intensity, and we really found no indication that we could predict deer population configuration with respect to these variables, except for the amount of edge in the habitat. So again, it didn't really give us tools for managing. The deer were dying primarily from hunting, predation vehicles, sharpshooters. So again, we had very few deer that died of end-stage chronic wasting disease in the time we were studying them, because it was a very slow to move through the population and a slowly progressing disease once they obtain it. Dispersal was interesting. it was very hard for us to convince the DNR that females were not dispersing. Now, we'd known this for many, many years. Work done back in the 70s in the Adirondacks and in the 60s in Indiana showed that female deer just don't leave, but very hard to convince people that this is, hunters, that this is what's happening. Yearling males were leaving before they were 1.5 years old. Almost all of them left by the time they were 2. They would leave during certain times of the year, so we had an idea of when it was being transmitted among social groups through the deer dispersal, and some characteristics of their patterns of dispersal too, directional related to landscape characteristics. But the big thing we really wanted to show was that we did not have radio collars on adult bucks. It's very problematic to fit them with those kinds of transmitters back then. Now we have other ways to do it. But the young males are the ones who are carrying it out across the landscape. The adult bucks, by and large, once they do establish a home range, they stay there for the rest of their life. It's a larger area, but the adult bucks, once they have dispersed, stay in the same area for the rest of their life for the most part. So it's the young males. And again, that was a message that was hard to convince, not so much the hunters. I think it was really the DNR that, because their strategy was we want to severely reduce the deer population, all age and categories and both genders. So it was a message they weren't particularly happy about. Exploratory movements, deer do a lot of moving in short periods of time, and most of the yearling males were exploring, yearling females were exploring, adult males were moving around but came back to a particular home range for most of the year. So there's a lot of movement across the landscape that we found that could also be related to the transmission of the disease. So that was an important thing for us to consider, and we have really no way to quantify that more than just knowing what percentage take these movements at some point in time during a week.
So that movement is different from dispersing though, because the females are actually coming back
Right.
to their home territory.
Right.
Is that kind of a new finding, that they're moving, but moving farther than you might think?
It was new in this context. I think that most deer biologists know that deer move around a lot, but the idea that the dispersal, a one-way departure to a new home range, is a well-known phenomenon, but I don't think it was well recognized that there's just a lot of movement going on at all times, and that they will leave and then come back, and we're not really sure why, what prompts that. So the disease clustering, again, was kind of the overarching thing that we were concerned about. Again, these are just real data to kind of show you on the landscape. We had one CWD positive deer, and these are points of where she was found. But these, based on our way of calculating home range, these are just kind of forays out here, but this was her core area. And again, you can see this clustering genetically related to her sisters, cousins, aunts in this area. So this is a matrilineal group. Okay, so our research team really came up with a better picture of what was happening on the landscape in terms of who's moving and how far they're going, what's related to habitat-wise to their movements, and did not send back a message that adult males were the ones that were just traveling long distances and carrying CWD. And we did not, at that point in time, find a strong evidence for disease clustering within a social group. I think if we went back now, we would probably find that. So let me talk a little bit more about the unknowns and why this is still a big concern, a big war, if you will, in Wisconsin and elsewhere. We don't know how chronic wasting disease is being transmitted. We still do not know. We think it could be direct contact from grooming, mother-offspring, through communication, scent communication, whether it is males licking urine, soil soaked with urine, female urine, but it's really an unknown. And there's limited evidence for direct transmission through lactation. So we have very little evidence, I should say. It's not a big concern that it's going directly from mothers to offspring through lactation or in utero. So that's not a primary means of transmission. Big questions about, again, communication through scrapes and rubs. I think deer behaviorists would say it's quite possible that when, you probably can't see, but that deer is rubbing, and he's a preorbital gland, and the prions are concentrating in the lymphatic system and in the glands, and they're probably being left on whatever they're rubbing for their scent communication. And if another deer comes along and licks soil that's been either urinated on or a rub and hits the same rub, it's possible they're getting the prions from that have been left behind. So big question about actual transmission that we have not resolved. Mineral licks, deer in general will use mineral licks coming out of the winter. They go after sodium, and this is a really, again, sorry for the granularity of that, but that is a deep lick that is probably maybe 2.5 feet deep that's been used for many, many years as a deer lick, and there's these traditional deer licks that they will come back to year after year, sometimes throughout the year, and eat the soil or lick the soil. So high potential for prions to be left behind in those licks. In 2009, one of my colleagues at Madison demonstrated that prions are taken up by plants. So further evidence that we're not going to get rid of prions on the landscape. It's not only is it in the soil, it's quite likely in the plants. And I think it wasn't until this came out in 2009 that the DNR was willing to basically give up and say, okay, we're going to live with chronic wasting disease and look at just discovering where else it's going to show up within Wisconsin, rather than going after it aggressively and trying to reduce the deer populations to slow the spread. I mean, it's there to stay. So there's some evidence of manganese oxide through a certain type of soil that seems to denature the proteins. So if you're thinking about a large-scale treatment to reduce the transmission through soils or possibly plant uptake, there's a possibility that there's a mechanism there, but that, again, is very difficult to think of that as large-scale management for large landscapes. All right, so fast forward to 2015. 2002, the DNR was thinking complete eradication of the disease, complete eradication of deer. There were people who were talking about really hammering the population on private lands. Private landowners fought back, and there were many subgroups of private landowners that were opposing the DNR. And in case you didn't know, that Wisconsin DNR has a international reputation for their sex, age, kill method of calculating deer populations. They were one of the forerunners many years ago in modeling deer, and so they had very sophisticated models. And that sex, age, kill was thrown out the door in political discussions very recently, and the scientists at the DNR were discredited after many years of using data in favor of the governor's preference for monitoring deer populations as whether they should be increased or decreased. You know, no one is really now going to be diving into the data to look at numbers per square mile. It's very difficult to calculate those, but Wisconsin was at the lead of the pack, head of the pack in trying to come up with computer models that many, many other states emulated. So the Walker regime has listened to the political constituents at this point. He has reorganized the Conservation Congress's ability to impact the DNR board, and it's now almost wholly politicized in terms of how the deer seasons are set, the harvest quotas are set. It's all based on really pressure from the top down. It's absolutely appalling. Dr. Deer and James Kroll, he's also dubbed the Deer Czar. Scott Walker hired him, so Governor Scott Walker hired him in 2011 to come in with a blue ribbon team and evaluate the data, evaluate the management actions, and come up with the answer to Wisconsin's CWD wars, if you will. And he came back with a report. It was pretty much thoroughly discredited by the scientists, and yet it gave recommendations that the governor has followed. So it was getting rid of the sex, age, kill methodology. You know, do you want more deer or you want less deer? That's what they're managing for. It was getting rid of their traditional deer management zones. and getting rid of the ernebuck. That was a huge one. Many hunters did not like that, but once you take away ernebuck, most hunters will default back to not harvesting does, so they'll be harvesting bucks only. And then finally, the Kroll report endorsed a do-nothing model. And at this point, the do-nothing might be just monitoring, and that's probably the only tool they do have at this point, just to track the spread because of the contamination of the environment and the uptake in the plants. But it was unfortunate, really unfortunate, that the governor intervened at this point and became the deer manager for the state. And it was catering to private interests, and some of the blogs and newspapers have come out with some very interesting comments on this about, the governor trying to pacify his constituents because they would contribute to his political campaign. And I don't know how many of you follow the political nightmares in Wisconsin in the past 4 or 5 years, but they're pretty appalling. And then, in a report that basically Walker invests in, and it was not really to do anything with deer, but it was really to support by a deer biologist's support for Scott Walker. So these are really nasty, conspiracy-driven types of comments that are being made, yet that is probably a very accurate depiction of how most people in at least the hunting community and the scientific community view this. There's not going to be, in my mind, a way to get over this very easily. And what's sad is, again, Wisconsin was a leader in deer management back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Chronic wasting disease hits, it pulls that fabric apart in the scientific community. It pits landowners against the government, against the researchers. And many of my friends in the DNR left and retired very, very bitter. These were people who gave their lives to their jobs. They were researchers. They were good people. And they left their profession feeling discredited and ineffective, partly and maybe mostly because of the politics of the chronic wasting disease situation. So it's interesting when I'm teaching classes, I talk to students about their trajectories and say, be aware that you go into a state agency, you have to be very thick-skinned because these are the kinds of things that you'll be dealing with, landowners, politics. It's a very messy, prickly world. So I went on a little bit longer than I wanted to, but that's kind of the overview of the deer wars that are continuing. I don't think it's a rosy picture. CWD is popping up in many more states. It's a function of testing. I think eventually we will see it maybe throughout North America. It's in about 30 states right now, and in Canada and in Mexico. Don't know when we'll find it here, but when we do, I hope that our DNR does manage it aggressively when it first shows up, because I think that's what should have been done. There was at least one example in Illinois where they went in with sharpshooters and they have slowed the spread of it, and it's down to a 1% occurrence in their hotspot versus a 25% occurrence or prevalence in the DNR's or in Wisconsin's hotspot. So, all right, so I'm going to end, and I'm happy to take some questions. So, okay. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. So originally you said when this had showed up that it was concern was about it spreading to humans or potentially cows or cattle. And that at what point has that been sort of disproven, or are we still unsure?
Yeah.
Or like what's the state of that?
Prion biologists will tell you don't ever believe it can't cross the barrier.
Okay.
Right? So it's still out there. Because it hasn't happened yet, people are very, I say, complacent and not very concerned, and so they're not using precautions. They're not getting their deer tested anymore. They're consuming them directly, even out of the hot spots. It hasn't been shown yet, and they haven't been able to induce it yet. But I wouldn't say that that's impossible.
Right.
Yeah. So would I consume a deer that hasn't been tested from a hot area? Definitely not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm really fascinated by this whole prion phenomenon. But they haven't really established yet what the transmission mechanism is, that I think you're telling us.
Right, among individuals.
Between the deer.
Right.
Because when you, oh, and the other thing you said is, you think it's actually throughout the deer population across the country, and it's just, we don't know it because we haven't tested.
I think it's many more places. I wouldn't say it's throughout the deer population.
Okay, but
I
it's-
think that it's going to be found in many more places.
So as soon as you said that the protein persists in the environment for up to 2 years, I thought,
Mhm.
oh, great, so you got a hunter in Colorado who's out there, he steps on a pile of poop, and then a year later, puts those boots back on when he goes out to Wisconsin, and he leaves it there.
Mhm.
I mean, is that a possible mechanism?
It is. And I'll tell you, my research site in western Dane County and eastern Sauk County outside of Madison, we had a field house with washing machines and boots and overalls and clothes, and anything that potentially came into contact with contaminated material could not leave the county. It had to stay there, and there are disposal facilities, but they've shown that it can't be autoclaved. There's really nothing that can denature the prions except for this manganese oxide, which is, so anyways, yes, to answer your question, it could be transmitted for a very long time if it's on contaminated material.
So the weird thing about the prion is it's not a living organism, it's simply a molecule that gets rearranged. So it could occur spontaneously somewhere else. It had to have occurred spontaneously somewhere to start with. So you could actually have it cropping up in different places originally.
That's exactly what they are predicting may have happened. They don't know if it came from Scrapie or if it was a spontaneous mutation. They still don't know how it showed up and how it started.
So one has to wonder if chemicals in the environment might be responsible for causing the molecule to change.
Yeah. I can't answer that, but a lot of people have asked that same question, especially with respect to mad cow, how that got started, how did Scrapie get started, and they've looked at correlations. Someone at one point was correlating it to the presence of jet overflights. So, I mean, really, they've looked at all kinds of things, and this is in yes. So it was really there's a lot of, I think, big question about a lot of research being done to look at for the various correlations. I'm not discounting anything at this point. I think that when we do find the root cause of it, we may be right. Maybe it's a spontaneous mutation, but it could be that we're looking at a similar organism that just changes over time. I don't know. Yeah. Yes, Andy.
First of all, you said 100% fatality. Is there any evidence of survivorship at all, ever?
Not long term. There is some evidence for genetic predisposition for resistance to it. So a couple of faculty up at University of British Columbia are looking at that. And I don't know the data well enough to know how long they resist, but there is some evidence that there are genetic characteristics that would predispose animals for not contracting it as quickly as other animals.
I ask that because I'm thinking of your first slide or second slide with the model, the donut.
Yeah.
And at the end, at the center of that donut, once things have moved out, I presume they're all dead, or is there still some alive?
Yeah. Well, the model will predict that they all die. And we saw that model, and then because we didn't see it spreading rapidly in the population, we discounted that model. But now, 15 years later, that model might be accurate, and as it starts to spread. But that was only based on direct animal contact. So that's how that model was developed. It was not including environmental contamination.
So, sorry, just a last follow-up.
Yeah.
If you just let it run and did nothing, what's the prediction?
Well, if you let that model run, where it was just...
Whatever model was best.
But take that one, because that's an interesting one. It's only based on animal-animal contact. It's not environmental contamination. You would expect it to repeat itself, right? And that donut would fill back in with the random dispersers, the males, and slow influx of females through enlarged social groups. And I think that model also did not account for the social behavior of females staying in their social groups. It looked at a higher dispersal rate of females. So it wouldn't look exactly like that, but eventually that would fill back in over time and might repeat itself if there was a seed to introduce it into the population again. Amy.
So I'm really interested in the comments you made throughout the presentation on the hunters' resistance to change their behaviors.
Yes.
To not only take doe, but to believe the science.
Yeah.
So this is perhaps part of a discussion that everybody's having right now on a deepening skepticism of science across the American public. Enough so as to call upon the governor and to sort of eclipse science altogether,
Yeah.
to politically ask the governor to step in on behalf of what they think is the right understanding. So I just wonder if you could comment on that a little bit more. And as we see climate change changing all kinds of wildlife patterns, you know, we heard from a speaker yesterday that the bears in Wyoming are out now after a very shortened winter.
Yeah.
Changing these kinds of patterns where the lay public or the hunter, the informed hunter might think, you know, let's change this, the way we've hunted bear. So I
Yeah.
just wonder if you could comment on the communication of science to the hunting community, and how we might better, or what you've learned through this science, or through this study, of how we might better bring them on into the knowledge we've gained.
So let me step back. I don't want to leave anybody with the impression that the hunting community did not understand the science. I think I alluded to that, but the hunting community may have understood the implications of the science better than the DNR. And I'll tell you why I think that's probably the case. I worked on a lot of private lands, and I had very strong relationships with all of the landowners. They were more than happy to let the researchers on the property. They welcomed us. They wanted to know about their deer, not only for themselves, but they love deer, they love the resource. And they became very well informed. In fact, they were the ones dredging up information on mad cow disease and looking at similarities and understanding, in some cases I think better than the DNR, the implications of the prion disease and their transmission. And they jumped very early to the conclusion that there's nothing you could do. They were convinced that it probably was in the landscape before the DNR admitted to that. They were convinced that because they knew deer behavior fairly well, as being well-informed and knowledgeable about deer behavior, they didn't think that you could eradicate deer off the landscape quickly enough to reduce the possibility of spreading. So they actually were the ones saying that we're going to live with it. What they didn't believe was that prions could jump the species barrier, and they were willing to live with chronic wasting disease in the background as long as there was no evidence for it to jump the species barrier. So they actually got out in front and said, we don't want to change our hunting patterns or culture because we don't think there's anything you can do to slow this down. We're
And
willing.
we're not at risk.
Right. They made the assumption that we're not at risk, and they still bear that out. Many are not testing their deer. The DNR was more optimistic, and they felt that we're an agency that knows how to manage deer. We can get out in front of this, and we can actually slow or eradicate it. So the DNR held out for a very long time with the goal of eradicating CWD until the late 90s when they finally gave in. So I think the citizens, by and large, were very aggressive in reading the literature and understanding it. They were diving into the details, and they didn't have a party line to toe. So as a researcher, this is another really personal experience, I felt more at odds with the DNR personally than I did with the private landowners. And a number of occasions came out in science meetings stating that based on my research, I felt it was impossible to eliminate it through the hunting tools that they had, and because I believed it was in the landscape, I said, I don't really think you're going to eliminate it. They were not happy about that. They felt for a long time they could. So back to your question, what's it take to communicate science? I think it's really important to, of course, be honest about it, and I think if the DNR got into a rock and a hard place, it was because they felt they knew the answer. They felt that their command and control approach to eradicating deer and eradicating the disease was the right way to go, and they didn't acknowledge that they might be wrong. And I think that's where they made their mistakes. So the landowners were willing to point out that You know, so far it hasn't jumped the species barrier, and so far we think we can live with it. Therefore, let's get back to normal with our expectations of a hunting season. So what that says for climate change, I'm not positive. I wouldn't assume that the general public is incapable of understanding the implications of science. They may not care about the mechanisms, but if they understand what the bottom line might be, if there is such a thing, they might be more accepting of the bottom line than an agency charged with managing a resource, such as what the DNR was. And I don't know how you would extrapolate that. But anyways, I was surprised at that, and always felt uncomfortable that my closest allies as researchers were actually the landowners, who understood what was going on and welcomed the research, and that we didn't come up with an answer that necessarily satisfied the DNR. It was more information, but not a perfect picture of what was going on.
So we're at 1 o'clock. I just want to say, first of all, thank you again to Dean Mathews, and we can carry this conversation on afterwards, but just in case anybody needs to leave, just thought we'd say thank you now.
Yep, thank you.